Hello Year 6, back for more letters from the Lighthouse today. We're going to do chapters 5 and 6. So chapter 5, Caring for Evacuees is a National Service. It was dark when we finally arrived, which wasn't a bad thing. I was tired of seeing cows and fields and trees and little country stations hung with bunting and WRVS ladies rushing forwards to welcome the train, which had been exciting at first, but after a while just made the journey seem longer. One by one the carriages had emptied out, and now, at last, it was our turn. "Bobmyth Point," announced the guard. "Train calling at Bobmyth Point." Everyone was on their feet before the train had even stopped. In a scramble of suitcases, our entire carriage made for the doors. Mr. Barrowman, shouting over our heads, told people to stop pushing. "One at a time," he hollered. "Remember your manners. This isn't the Harrods Sale." No one was listening. We were too eager to see what Bobmyth Point was like, so in the end the guards simply opened the train doors and we tumbled out onto the platform. There was no bunting, no WRVS women to greet us. It felt oddly quiet after the noise of the train, and for a moment everyone seemed a bit stunned. "You all right?" I asked Cliff, dumping his suitcase in front of him. He nodded. "Smells different here, doesn't it?" He was right. The air smelled wet, salty. With a shiver of delight, I thought of the sea. Tomorrow we'd go to the beach, see the lighthouse, find seashells like the ones Dad used to bring us. In fact, I was beginning to feel quite hopeful when two ladies in Wellington boots appeared from the direction of the ticket office. They were having an argument. "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, are you telling me how to do my job, Miss Carter?" "Of course not, but if she's a kinder transport child..." As Mr. Barrowman cleared his throat, they broke apart with a startled, "Oh!" "You must be our evacuees," cried the shorter and rounder of the two women, as if we'd dropped from the sky. She looked like someone from a murder mystery story, the type who wore tweeds and drank sherry. "Indeed, I suppose we must," Mr. Barrowman replied. He did sarcasm as well as any teacher. "Then welcome to Bobmyth Point." She threw open her arms rather theatrically. A titter went through the group, which Mr. Barrowman quickly shushed. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. I've lived here all my life, and this," she indicated the other woman sniffily, "is Miss Carter, who's been here not quite a week." Miss Carter was a lot younger than Mrs. Henderson. She had blonde hair cut to her jaw and looked thoroughly fed up. "All I suggested was..." Ignoring her, Mrs. Henderson said, "Allow us to escort you to the village hall where you'll be introduced to your host families." She made it sound just round the corner. In reality, it was a good half an hour's walk down a dark country road with only her and Miss Carter's torches to guide us. Away from the shelter of the station, I felt the full force of the wind, so strong you had to lean into it as you walked. One of the older boys started telling a ghost story called The Hairy Hands, and I could feel Cliff next to me, hanging on his every word. Worried he'd have bad dreams, I tried to walk faster so we'd be out of earshot, but up ahead was Esther Jenkins. A different type of nightmare, and I thought it best to keep out of her way. By the time we reached the village, I'd blisters on my palms from my suitcase handle. Perhaps Mum had been right about those extra books after all. I was ravenous too, and wondered what Queenie might have made of our supper. It was hard to see anything of Bobmyth Point itself. The dark felt even thicker than the blackout in London, though I could just about make out the outline of houses on either side of the road. "Crikey, it's so quiet here," one of the girls observed. "Bobmyth Point? Bobmyth Dump, more like," Esther Jenkins muttered. A few of the boys pretended to laugh. Cliff squeezed my hand and I squeezed back, just to let him know I was there. Then I saw light. Not from Mrs. Henderson's torch. This was something bigger, out beyond the houses. It wasn't constant like the searchlights over London, but every few moments sent out a beam so strong that in it I glimpsed the grey water and white-topped waves of what had to be the sea. My heart gave a little skip. "That's the lighthouse," said Miss Carter, who appeared beside me. "Beautiful, isn't it? A beacon to guide the lost to safety." It was beautiful. I'd never seen a real working lighthouse before. The way its light reached far out into the darkness was mesmerising to watch. Miss Carter sighed. There's talk of turning it off now, though. It's a threat to national security, apparently, because the enemy's been using landmarks like this to navigate their planes. When they come over to bomb us, you mean? I'd heard something similar back in London, about German pilots following the Thames to find their targets. Exactly that. This war, I thought bleakly, this horrid, horrid war. Even down here in the wilds of Devon, we couldn't escape it. Inside the village hall was a table laid for tea. It was a decent-looking spread, thick white bread with proper butter underneath the jam and slices of dark, crumbly fruitcake. But Mr. Barrowman shooed us away from the table. "We're not here to eat the locals out of house and home," he said sternly. "Can't we have some?" whispered Cliff, who I knew would be starving. "No one else has, so we'd best not," I answered. "We don't want Queenie to think we've got worms. At least people weren't lying when they said you got better food in the country. This lot looked wholesome and fresh and gave me high hopes for what we'd eat tonight at Queenie's." Behind the table stood a group of women, who I guessed were locals. Even the younger ones were still dressed in the long skirts and bell hats Londoners had worn in the other war, the one that ended 22 years ago. "Which is Queenie?" Cliff asked. I didn't know, I'd never seen a photo. In my head I pictured her as tall, like Gloria, with a warm, smiley face. Being Suki's pen pal, she was bound to be the fun-loving, lipstick-wearing, jitterbugging type who'd be friendly and welcoming towards us. It was bewildering that no one in the group fitted her description. These women didn't even smile. They were pointing at us evacuees, discussing us, like they were choosing what cake to have for tea. "I'm looking for help with milking my jerseys," said a woman with large front teeth. "Someone who's not shy of getting up at dawn." The older kids seemed to think this a right lark, especially the boys, most of whom had probably never been near a live cow before. Within moments they were falling over themselves to volunteer. "Don't take all the best ones, Pole," another woman complained, which started them off bickering over who'd get the strongest boys. It wasn't exactly fun, hovering like a spare part while everyone else got picked. There was no sign of anyone who might be Queenie either. I grew anxious again, wondering how much longer we'd have to wait. Cliff leaned his head sleepily on my shoulder. "Do you think she's forgotten us?" he yawned. "Course not, you dafty." I tried to stay cheerful for both our sakes. "She's probably just adding the finishing touches to our supper." "What do you reckon she's made us?" I thought for a moment. "Steak pie, probably, with bread and butter pudding for afters." "And custard?" I nodded. A whole jugful, which made Cliff's stomach rumble so loud I actually heard it. Yet as the hall began to empty and Queenie still didn't appear, I wondered if there'd been some sort of mix-up, or perhaps she'd changed her mind about having us, being too upset about Suki's disappearance, and we'd be put on the next London train home. I wished someone would tell us what was going on. What unsettled me more was the sound of crying coming from the back of the hall, though I couldn't see who was making it. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Carter and one of the local women blocked the view. "You mustn't think like that," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "None of this is your fault." "If anyone's to blame, it's Hitler," Miss Carter added. "Every time I get settled, I have to move again." The voice was a girl's, wobbly with tears. "I liked it at the Jenkinsons' house. It was all right, you know." "Once the bombing stops, you can go back to the Jenkinses again, can't you, eh?" said Mrs. Henderson. "But even that's not my real home, is it?" the girl sobbed. "I know, lovey, I know," soothed Mrs. Henderson. I still couldn't see the person crying, but with a start I recognised her voice. The strange, gruff twang was a giveaway, as was the name Jenkins. "Crikey," I muttered under my breath. If someone as tough as Esther Jenkins could cry, there wasn't much hope for anyone else. But for us and the little group surrounding Esther, the hall was now completely empty. I felt miserable. We might as well have stuffed ourselves with the bread and jam. No one would have noticed. I was about to take some for Cliff and myself when Mrs. Henderson looked round. "Oh, you poor mites!" she gasped in surprise. "You're still here?" "Yes, we are," I said dismally. I waited for her to say something, to tell us what to do, but she simply looked at her watch and frowned. "So, is Queenie coming for us?" I asked. She let out a big bellow of a sigh. "That's the plan, though goodness knows where she is. I can't wait forever. I've got my goats to milk." Cliff and me glanced at each other. Why would anyone milk a goat? "I specifically told her to be here at 6, Mrs. Henderson continued. "This isn't good. It isn't good at all." "Perhaps she got the day wrong?" I offered, though it sounded pretty feeble. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "It's those clocks of hers. Very romantic, but terribly impractical." I didn't know what Mrs. Henderson meant, but I was starting to realise my days of counting on grown-ups and big sisters were over. I was going to have to take charge myself. I turned to Cliff. "Buck up. Let's grab our things, shall we? If Queenie won't come to us, we'll go to her." Which was all very well, except we didn't know where the post office was. Chapter 6. Do Your Duty. The sight of us setting off into the dark brought Mrs. Henderson running. Together we soon found Queenie's house, which stood halfway down the main street. Just as Gloria predicted, you could see the lighthouse properly from here, or as properly as was possible in the dark. "This is it," Mrs. Henderson shouted over the wind. "The post office." Yet the post office part was only one small bay window with the blinds pulled down. The rest of the house towered above us, important looking, with wide steps leading up to a huge front door. My jaw dropped in amazement at the size of it. "Blimey," Cliff gasped. "It's massive." Shivering with cold and tiredness and the last glimmers of excitement, I tucked my arm through his. "Isn't it marvellous?" I couldn't wait to see inside. Yet after 3 hearty raps on the front door, Queenie still didn't appear. "She'll be down in the cellar, unable to hear us," Mrs. Henderson muttered in annoyance. "Knock on the glass, Olive, will you?" And she pointed to the left of the steps where, almost hidden by ivy and blackout curtains, was a cellar window. I did as she asked. Finally, as we heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the door, a sudden bout of shyness came over me. The person I was about to meet was Suki's pen pal. She'd be wonderful, I was certain. I just hoped she didn't mind having us foisted on her, a pair of windswept, homesick kids. The door inched open. From behind it peered a small, plain-looking woman who at first glance could have been 15 or 50. She was wearing an enormous green sweater that reached her knees. Assuming she was the housekeeper, I stared past her into the hallway. "Your evacuees are here, Queenie," Mrs. Henderson said rather pointedly. "Guys, don't come in, please. I'm trying to film something. Can you go back out? Go right out, please. Sorry about this, Year 6. Hurry up, out. Thank you. Do apologise. Where were we? The woman clapped a hand over her mouth. "Oh, is it that time already?" I put down my suitcase in surprise. So this was Queenie? I could see now she wasn't that old. She wore glasses and had freckles and reddish poker straight hair. I supposed I was expecting someone fashionable like Suki, and she wasn't. Clearing my throat, I stammered. We live next door to Gloria in London. She, arranged for us to come and stay." Queenie eyed us coolly. Her glasses were so thick it was like being stared at through a fish tank. "You're rather weedy looking. I was expecting someone stronger." I blinked, taken aback. Suki always said I was slender, which sounded nicer, even if it wasn't true. Queenie brightened. "Can you run? Who's the faster, you or your brother?" I stuttered. "I'm not sure." "I was the fastest in my class at school," Cliff chipped in. "And even weedier than your sister by the looks of you," Queenie remarked. Cliff stared at her, wide-eyed and open-mouthed. It was almost funny, except it was taking all my concentration now not to burst into tears. Mrs. Henderson sighed. "For heaven's sake, Queenie, let the poor devils at least get inside. They're exhausted. I'm checking their credentials, Queenie replied sharply. I need workers, Mrs. H. You know how busy it's been here since I lost the Jensen boys. Who are the Jensen boys? Cliff asked before I could. Queenie ignored him. It was Mrs. Henderson who explained. A couple of local lads who worked for Queenie in the shop doing deliveries. They've been called up for the army. I'll be expecting you two to pull your weight, Queenie added. Call it the war effort if you like, but be warned, I've no time for idlers. My hopes of exploring the beach tomorrow faded, though I was willing to do my bit, more than willing, especially if it meant getting back at Mr. Hitler. I'd lost my dad to this stupid war, which surely meant I had the right credentials. I'd have explained this too, had Mrs. Henderson not given me a little shove in the direction of the door. In you go, she said. We stumbled inside. I was glad to be out of the wind at last, but as the door closed, I realised Mrs. Henderson was no longer with us, and I suddenly didn't feel so brave about being on our own. She's gone to milk her goats, I reminded Cliff, who managed a feeble smile. Reaching for his hand, I put the last of Gloria's toffees in his palm. Queenie took us into a hallway. There weren't coats or umbrellas or gas masks hung on hooks like at home. This hall smelled fusty as a church, and echoed like one too, as the floor was paved with flagstones. The only light came from the candle Queenie held. It wasn't what I expected. None of this was. Follow me, she said, leading us deeper into the house. From the hall we went up a staircase, lugging our suitcases, satchels and gas mask boxes. All day I'd built up an idea of Queenie in my head. The reality was different, and I had to admit, horribly disappointing. She hadn't remembered we were coming. She hadn't even mentioned Suki, and she was supposed to be her friend. As for supper, I was beginning to give up hope. At the top of the stairs we trudged along a landing where the floor tilted and creaked, and where the dark grew even darker. She's not on the electric, is she? Cliff hissed in my ear. Doesn't look like it, I agreed, wondering what else Gloria hadn't told us about her sister. Finally, we stopped in front of another staircase, this one so steep it was almost vertical. I've put you in the attic, Queenie said. Beside me, I sensed Cliff stiffening up. He hated heights, and those stairs, slippery, painted, uncarpeted wood, looked capable of breaking necks. You'll want to unpack, I expect. Don't let me keep you, muttered Queenie, though once she'd given me what was left of her candle, it was obviously us keeping her. Cliff and I shared a bewildered look. I don't mean to be rude, I said, but are we having supper? Are you expecting me to cook? She made it sound like I'd asked for a trip to the moon. We haven't eaten since the train, Cliff replied, swallowing his toffee in one gulp. Queenie said nothing. I knew when we were beaten. I'm done in, Cliff. Let's just go to bed. The attic stairs weren't as bad as all that. I made sure of it by insisting Cliff go first, so if he slipped I'd at least try to catch him. At the top were our bedrooms, 2 huge rooms that stretched the whole length of the house. There wasn't much furniture in mine. A bed, a chest of drawers, a bedside table, a rag rug on the floor. It reminded me of a horrid boarding school, the sort that naughty children get sent to in stories. Despite putting away my skirts and sweaters and arranging my hairbrush and clips on the bedside table, it still didn't feel homely. My books looked lost on the huge, wide windowsill. I didn't even unpack Dad's seashell. Cliff's room was just as vast and cold, with a bed that sagged like a hammock. This I found out as I perched on it to wish him good night. It won't be forever, I promised. I'm sure we'll have a decent breakfast in the morning. Luckily, Cliff was already falling asleep. It's not that bad, he mumbled into the pillow, though I was really hoping she'd have a dog. It was Queenie's chilly welcome that sat uneasily with me. Odd that our sister, popular, fun, pretty as a pin-up, would be friends with someone who wore old droopy sweaters and didn't actually seem to like people very much. Other than being a similar sort of age, I couldn't think what they had in common. Back in my room, I got into bed. The sheets, the pillowcases, everything felt damp with cold. Heaping all the blankets I could find over me, I climbed back under the covers and decided to write a postcard home to Mum. We'd all been given a pack of blank ones earlier by Mr. Barrowman. "Keep your messages cheerful," he'd warned us. "No homesick blubbing, no moaning about your hosts. Your parents have more important things to worry about than you lot." Blowing on my almost numb fingers, I got to work. Monday the 10th of February 1941. Dear Mum, the train took 7 whole hours, but it was jolly good. But it was jolly good fun meeting the other children on board. Queenie's just how I imagined her. She's made us ever so welcome. We've got our own big bedrooms, so Cliff's happy, though he wishes there was a dog here. Lots of love, Olive. And there you are. Picture of the postcard. The candle Queenie'd given me soon burned low. What helped was the lighthouse beam as it swept through the attic. Count to 6 and it was dark. Count another 6 and it went bright again, edging the blackout curtains with gold. It didn't bring any heat though, and once I'd done the postcard, I got out of bed and put on Mum's coat over my nightdress. It smelled faintly of Suki still, and something smoky and bitter. Giving it a big sniff, I breathed my sister in, though the smoke smell was stronger and I didn't like the way it reminded me of the air raid, filling my head with shadows. Enough, I told myself. Go to sleep. Couldn't get comfortable. The sandwich wrappers from earlier were still stuffed in my pocket, and every time I moved they crackled. In the end I took them out, yet when I lay down again the rustling noise was still there, coming from inside the coat. I checked the pockets again. Both were empty. What I could feel was something stuffed into the lining. Intrigued, I sat up, lighting the remaining stub of candle. I was now able to see loose threads in the seam below the pocket, a slit big enough to put my hand in and pull out a folded up piece of paper, though at first it looked so wrinkled I thought it was a tissue. Then I saw the writing. It was big and clear and nothing like Suki's own. It wasn't a letter. I wasn't actually sure what it was, but I spent a good few minutes staring at it. It looked like this. I wondered if it was measurements, or a lock number, or a list of those plates that go on the front of cars. Yet the more I studied it, the more I felt uneasy and certain it was some sort of code. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for stopping by. My computer has locked itself, so you're going to hear me and then I put my password in wrong. So I'm just going to ramble on for a few more seconds until I can press stop. Bye.